Hey everyone, welcome to the Func Med Nation podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Steve Noseworthy. The views and opinions of guests on this podcast are their own and may differ from my own. But as always, I try to be respectful of other people's opinions, even when we might disagree. So I started the podcast 2, maybe 3 years ago, and really the intent was for me to have conversations with people that I wanted to ask questions of.
Oh, wow.
And then I just kind of figured that if I have these questions, other people do as well. So I feel like it's my role in the podcast to really just kind of sit in the stead of all the practitioners out there that are doing functional or integrated medicine that maybe don't know people that I might know or know someone who knows somebody else. And so it's been my great honor and privilege to talk with some pretty cool people. And I count you among those because I still remember that first day that we met. It was a seminar. I can't remember what seminar it was that I was teaching in North Carolina. And you paid me the kindest of compliments at some point. So I've been looking forward to this for a very long time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah. So why don't we consider, like we're already recording, so let's just consider that we're rolling. And for those of you who are listening, this is Dr. Brad Rachman. And Brad, instead of me actually reading through the bio that you sent me, I'm going to have you introduce yourself, if you don't mind. Just take, a minute or so and just kind of go through your qualifications, because it's always, anybody who doesn't know you, their first question is, why should I listen to this guy? And again, for those of you who are listening or watching, like, you want to listen to this guy. He's been around for a while. He's got a rich background, not just as a clinician, but as an educator, and he's worked in different sides of the functional medicine world, working with Genova Diagnostics. So, Dr. Brad Rachman, why don't you give us a little elevator pitch about who you are and what your background is?
Thank you, and thanks for saying all of that. And I'm just a curious guy, and I was that propeller head kid, who just was really interested in how the body worked and how machines worked, and I was a maker. And when I became introduced to I'm going to call it the alternative medicine space, because I got sick in college, which we'll talk about maybe a little later. And then I was introduced to some more traditional Western ways of treating, and then also some alternative. And alternative to me at that point just meant anything that wasn't Western. And it thoroughly intrigued me. It hit me on a visceral level, Steve. It was just so organic, and it made sense. That engineering mind of mine was like, I want to know why things work. I don't want to put a Band-Aid on something.
Yeah.
And after my primary training, I went right into a deep dive into this kind of new burgeoning area. Back then, like, that was in the mid to late 80s, which was like functional medicine. Like, nobody even knew what that was. When I would mention to patients, hey, I'm pivoting a little bit here into this space called functional medicine, no one had a grasp of that. Yeah. And I had a joke that I used to say that, like, I guess it infers that everything else is dysfunctional. And in some ways, there's a little bit of truth to that. And also, it talks to something that makes sense to a lot of other people other than me, which is, if we can figure out how to take away the noise, and if we can take away the blockages, the imbalances that are stopping people from expressing their natural state, which I believed, my cosmology has always been that we were designed by our maker to be well and to stay well. So it didn't take long. I got my dog wanting to be in the podcast. It didn't take long to, become, really established in this space. I loved how laboratory medicine was my tea leaves. It was the way that I could get, people use muscle testing, and people use pulses, and people use and other systems, other techniques, and labs just like hit the science part of my brain really well.
Yeah.
And then I realized
I have to say that I had a similar experience. right? Just in terms of my first exposure to functional medicine was Datis Karazian teaching a blood chemistry course in Fort Lauderdale.
Yeah.
And it opened my eyes to a world I didn't even know existed at that point. And I'd been, in practice as a chiropractor for, probably 12 years or so at that point. And to think, I just, maybe just to kind of get outside of myself for a second, I feel bad for clinicians who are so monolithic in their training and their practice, and all they see is what they know, right? And to not have been exposed to functional medicine, and to think that I could be another, almost 20 years down the road in clinical practice and not know what I know now.
Right.
I wouldn't want to be that doctor. I really wouldn't want to be that doctor.
It's a bias. Like we all have. I used to think that science in general proclaimed to be unbiased, but there's a lens, right, through which we all use. And I appreciate my lens got bigger. That's all I could say. Like I'm so grateful that I started out with a pretty big lens.
Yeah.
And my colleagues started asking how I was doing what I was doing. I don't know if I was doing it well. This is almost 40 years ago, and I do not know. I mean, I do know that I wasn't great at it. I had a lot of enthusiasm for what I was doing, and patients seemed to get better. And I know that I, was not nearly as efficient as I am now. And I also, don't create as many symptoms on my path to helping people get better. I think in the beginning I created a lot of symptoms because I didn't understand some principle.
Sure.
Which feels bad in retrospect, but I do think in general there was more benefit than harm. But it definitely turned into something where I became a mentor to a lot of individuals, and I was welcomed into a very large diagnostic medicine, diagnostic laboratories, provider at that point, which at that point was called Great Smoky's Diagnostic Lab. This was way back, in the late 80s, and I was asked to kind of head up the medical teaching part where we would train doctors, because I was just good at doing that. I had been doing that for a while, and also head up research and development. So like new tests, what could we do that are going to help clinicians to diagnose things? And that was a big eye opener. I went from kind of private practice and maybe an office of a few individuals that I led to a laboratory that was 300 employees, and held a really responsible position. I felt some days like a complete imposter, because I had no skills really. I had terrible skills in management, but I'm a good learner, and I wanted to be good at what I did, and I wanted to understand how to serve practitioners at that level. And I learned a lot. I would never, as hard as it was and difficult, I would never have given up my opportunity to learn all the different sides of the laboratory space. Yeah. And there's some really interesting insights that came out of that, which
I would love to hear that. So let me ask you to put a pin in that one, because I want to dedicate some time to talking about your experience with what we now know as Genova Diagnostics. But let's go back to the autoimmune disease. You said that you suffered some ill health, and I think it was in your 20s. That was, kind of your origin story that made you look outside of allopathic. If you can share whatever detail, you don't have to share tons, but what was going on, and what was your frustration that led you to seek answers outside?
I was in undergraduate school for biomedical engineering, and I started getting some really bad gut stuff. And I had never had that in my life, and nothing was resolving. And of course, I went through kind of the standard medical stuff there, which is essentially some medications to try to slow down motility, but it wasn't getting to the bottom of it. And they couldn't find an infection. It's kind of at that point, to them, it seemed like a needle in a haystack, and maybe not all that important. We didn't understand the biome. And it migrated, through my clinical training until I was like a year from graduating. I was knee deep in residency. I bolted out of bed one morning, and my spine just felt like it was crumbled. Like, I don't know how to describe it to people other than broken glass. And it took a little while to untangle that there was an autoimmune problem occurring where, and it's called ankylosing spondylitis, and for those that don't know it, it's similar to rheumatoid arthritis, but it doesn't affect the appendicular skeleton. It affects the axial skeleton. It affects the spine. And you never see people's joints all gnarled up in their hands and then they can't bend those. Well, that's what happens to the spine. And then it's called bamboo spine disease because the natural progression of it is, the spine just, instead of being these movable segments, a couple dozen movable segments, they all fuse together. And literally in an x-ray, we're taught, like, as you know, it looks like a piece of bamboo because there's these bridging bones. What nobody ever tells you is that in the act of bridging these bones every night, the bones are kind of growing together with micro shards. And then when I just remember turning over in bed and just breaking my back, all throughout the night. It was painful. It was an extraordinary, probably the most painful thing I've ever experienced. And it went on for a long time. And I got to a rheumatologist who said, okay, well, here's the deal. You have a decision to make. You have two choices: standing up or lying down. And I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And he said, well, do you want your spine to freeze in a more upright standing position, or do you want it to freeze like where you're just lying down all the time? And I'm like, I got to get out of your office because this sounds so bad. None of
those are my only two choices.
I don't think you're helping me very much. I don't think I said that, but I did leave. And it started my path, Steve, to try to unpack something I knew very, very, very little of: the immune system and inflammation, and something I credit Dr. Krasian and you and others, like these giants that I have stood on the shoulders of to understand this. There was nobody back then who really knew much about any of this. So it took some understanding and some digging and some research. And I got pretty far into trying to understand that this was not an issue where it was a real disease. Because even though I was oriented towards not thinking that the label mattered, it kind of stuck after a while. And what I came to understand was that this was a lack of regulation of my immune system. It was not behaving well. It was over-responding, and it was overreacting to things that I was unaware of. I really couldn't tease apart the cause and effect. I do understand it now. Gluten, certain environmental toxins like mold, just really still they could light me up pretty good. But for the most part, it took a decade, but I unwound the thing. I eventually met my wife, who is a yoga therapist and massage therapist of incredible intuition and connection. And she kind of finished off the layers of the cake to help me once the inflammatory stage was kind of resolved for me. At least it was put to bed. I was resolving inflammation better than I ever have. She got things moving again, all the stiff parts. So I think I still have a few frozen segments in my spine, and my spine doesn't look like everybody else's, and my posture doesn't look like everybody else's, but it's hardly anything I can't do, and I don't hurt anymore.
Yeah, and that's an interesting comment about your spine doesn't look like everyone else's, but your function is somewhat preserved. And I just remember seeing one of the social media accounts that I follow was talking about a paper published recently, and this is probably more germane to those of us in this space that are chiropractors and do manual type medicine. But looking at studies where you might have similar findings on X-ray, CT, or MRI of degenerative changes, disc lesions, herniations, and so on. And you and I both know, even we don't have to be functional medicine practitioners, but you and I both know that someone can have a really ugly looking X-ray and be pain-free and relatively mobile. And somebody else, their spine might look absolutely pristine on an X-ray, posturally as well as the integrity of the joints, and they're in tremendous pain and disability. And but it kind of teases around the idea of form and function and how they're related. And those are, just put those two labels out there, and they're just very, very broad umbrellas that a whole bunch of other stuff fits up underneath.
Yeah. And just to pivot on that, because that's so true, I don't think labs are that different. I think that when I have a new patient and I see a group of labs and they're rough, I mean, I'm looking at optimal ranges and I'm looking at more traditional standard ranges. which I'd like to get into with you. And, the patients are looking at it with me as we're reviewing it. And of course, they can be horrified because,
Yeah.
I created some reports with some good colors. Green's great, and
Sure.
yellow's a little bit not great,
Sure.
and then red's real, and there's a whole red. And you could see that they're really troubled by, like, the fact is, out of 3 dozen lab values, 2 dozen of them are in the red. And I try to remind them that this is not their body breaking, but their body acting like Jenga. It's trying to adapt. Now, it may not be really good at adapting. The body is going to try to get to that steady state, that homeostatic state.
Yeah.
But most of what we see on labs are not necessarily cause. Somehow we think labs are magical. They're not. They're just like an X-ray. They're just like something else. There's a lot going on there, and a lot of it is effect. And I didn't get really good at figuring out what was cause and what was effect on the labs until maybe the last 10 years.
Mm.
And then, like, some insight happened, which is like the ability to see labs. I mean, I think it's magical for me because I could just, as you can, just look at me like, I got it. Like, I understand your physiology now, like that. And it seems a little like sorcery or magic to look at a lab and to be able to do that. But it's a lens, right, that you can train yourself to be able to look through.
Yeah, we're getting dangerously close to talking about the topic that you chose for today, because I gave you the choice of what to talk about, and that is vitalism. And I think I'd like to put that at the end of the conversation.
Yeah.
I'm going to bring you back to your days with Genova. In fact, I'm going to ask you some very large picture questions first, like, because you've been involved in functional medicine very early on. Did you do your early training with Jeff Bland?
I did.
You did? Okay, so you were essentially there in the beginning, even probably when the concepts and the principles of functional medicine were being formulated.
Yes.
Yeah. So if you look back over the course of your career and just the industry of the profession, what do you think has changed from the beginning to now? And not necessarily just in your perception, but your observation of how we as a collective think about and apply functional medicine principles in practice.
I think that a number of things have occurred. As with all things that are new, unusual, and disruptive, they're first looked at, with this jaundiced eye, right? And nobody kind of begins to accept, hey, there's this thing in labs called functional ranges, and there's a thing in the body called function, and the functions aren't these pathologic processes we think of like a real path process we both learned, in training was like, okay, tissues break down, and we just think of things like necrosis, and we realize there's these other pathophysiologic processes like a detoxification imbalance or a lack of immune regulation, right, or endocrine disruption. So that world has gotten sufficiently large because when I remember going to my first workshop with Jeff Bland, and we just talked about kind of the gut and detoxification. Now, still, those are really 2 great places to start when you think about it. And you could probably wind up alleviating 80% of somebody's issues if you only had those 2 tools. But we've spun outward into an understanding of dysglycemia, the imbalance of blood sugar. We've spun outward another circle to what happens in the mitochondria. We're getting into proteomics and epigenetics in a beautiful way. We're going outward in these ripples now to where, and I'm sure there will be more. I mean, I'm just beginning to get into proteomics in a big way. And that's just another ring. It's not another parallel universe. It's another way of understanding the body's expression. That toolbox is big now.
Yeah.
2 tools and now ostensibly a dozen tools.
Yeah.
That's big. And not a tool, I don't mean, I think everyone's following, but I'm not like a tool to fix, but a tool to understand what could be going on with the body. That's changed. In the same way that something that was originally viewed as novel and maybe with a little bit of a jaundiced eye is now a little bit co-opted, where I see functional medicine being used to describe alternative medicine, non-allopathic medicine. And nothing could be further from the truth, because the real definition of it is not someone who offers hormone replacement therapy.
Right.
That could be part of it. You could absolutely need that.
Yeah.
And that could be a key linchpin in like somebody's whole thing. But it isn't the treatment tool. It's the understanding of the mechanics of what's going on inside.
Yeah.
What is lacking? What is being impaired? What is not? What's stopping the expression of health? And I've seen functional medicine bend a little bit in that direction, to where I don't think Jeff Blaine even calls it functional medicine anymore. Like he's like spawned another thing, which is personal.
Yeah, and I do think the term functional medicine has been, I don't know that co-opted is the right word.
Yeah,
I think I see. I think I see similar trends. Like I think it's a testament to the design of the human body that you referred to earlier, that you can spend your entire clinical practice career only doing detox and gut support and help an awful lot of people.
Yeah.
Right. But if all you do is, put someone on a XYZ protocol for gut and detox, is that really functional medicine? I would argue it's an aspect of that, right? Because I do think that functional medicine, as I think you're implying, maybe stating explicitly, is this, it's a complex arena and we still yet only know a portion of it. We're still discovering more about human function and physiology and the intricacies of how everything is interconnected. And I think that what allows clinicians to be really successful in this space, and maybe by that, I don't mean financially successful or, how many patients are you seeing in the run of a day or a year? I mean successful in being able to help a large portion of people who walk through your door, including the complex cases. And I don't think you can play in that sandbox of complexity if you don't understand, at least to a nominal degree, the complexity of physiology. Would you agree with that statement, or how would you amend that?
I think that was beautifully said, and I think that's absolutely to the point. And if you're a plumber and all you've got are a certain set of tools, there's going to be a lot you're going to encounter in a home that does not relate to that you can't help. And you can try to tighten up the pipes, but you're not going to fix an electrical problem in the house.
Sure.
And it isn't just about the toolbox of the plumber, but it's the orientation. Right? A plumber knows about water flow in and out of a house. But someone who really understands, every element is a master, because they can really come in and say, that crack in the wall and that leak over there, they're related to a foundational issue.
Yeah.
But let's get down to the root cause. Your foundation is you're losing this corner of your house. That's why your pipes are cracking, and that's why your walls are cracking, and that's why your electrical system goes in and out of your kitchen all the time. So it's that broadness that matters. It's holding the biggest possible picture. And every time I thought in a workshop, okay, well, this is the biggest possible picture anybody could ever have. Like, this is amazing. This is a new set of tools to diagnose and to understand, and more importantly, to see a patient. Something else expands a little bit more. So I'm grateful for that, and in awe of how the body is fearfully and wonderfully made. And just as we're trying to characterize another way of how the body is trying to regulate itself, there's more there.
Yeah, I like the idea of looking at lab results more as an indication of how the body is trying to make corrections, rather than this is a disease process or a pathophysiology. And maybe those lines get blurred somewhere along the way, right? Because I do think that in an attempt to make corrections, if that process goes too far and you don't have the, I know there's a technical word for it, and it's escaping me right now, but you don't have the ability to rein in like an extreme response, I think then you start bordering onto pathophysiology. And, maybe understanding the distinction between those two things is only hard won through clinical experience. Right. Seeing person after person that might be in that realm. I'm interested, I want to ask you about your clinical model here in a second, but I want to go back to your time at Genova. What was it like Because you said you were involved early on, and part of your responsibility was deciding what tests to offer clinicians. And I have said in seminars before, because I think we're in a different time and place from a diagnostic standpoint than, say, when you started in practice, because there are a lot of, in my opinion, there are a lot of labs out there that offer tests that you can spend your own money or your patient's money on and get valid data that's not clinically relevant.
Right.
Because the way that I look at it is that labs are businesses. They have to make a profit. And I wonder how much, when labs are trying to decide what labs are going to offer to the marketplace, how much of the conversation is driven about, well, what do clinicians need versus what can we sell?
Right.
What's your opinion on that?
I think there is a perspective, at least during my tenure in that industry, of both of those things going on. And it was a little less nefarious than it sounds, because there was a whole group of frontier tests. They were coming out of research, and that's where we found all this stuff. We would dig into the papers and some brilliant guy or gal in University of Wakanuga, wound up coming up with this really cool way of looking at lipids, and they related to oxidative stress and more specifically to glutathione metabolism. And then you're like, God, that would be really good. Then the question is, how do you bring that to market in an affordable way? And then if you do that and you make that investment, is anyone going to buy it? And they're not going to buy it as a single test. So there was in that area of functional medicine, there is this imperative to panelize. There's rarely one test that will ever be marketable and cost effective, or it'd be $900 to run a single analyte. And there are a few. You can run an MTHFR test for methylation and get some really good value, and you would be willing to pay $100 or $200 for that. But for the most part, there's this mandate to panelize, and by that I just mean find a bunch of things that work together and create a cardiovascular panel out of it that you can help a patient assess that. That became the financial mandate, which is how do you make it affordable, marketable, something that somebody will buy? And then there's a third category, which is how do you make it so the average clinician who may not want to go deep dive into all this lab stuff, that they can actually action something with a patient?
Yeah.
That it doesn't provide some limp data point, which may be lit up, but they don't know what to do with it. I think to be honest with myself, I think I was more valuable in many ways to Genova earlier in my tenure. I was there and interacted with that company in one way or another over a 5 to 10 year period. And I think I was more valuable in the beginning because I had more clinical feet on the street knowledge. And I was less valuable because I really didn't understand the process of how to do this, how to pull out of the literature something valuable that no one else is running, that they can't get at LabCorp or Quest or any of their ABC labs out there. And I got better in the element of the product, and I think I helped to get, my contribution was maybe to help the company to understand how to bring things to market in more limited panels that are really targeted and helpful. But it became clear, at least in my last 2 years, that I felt, my mandate on my clinical team, we had lost touch with patients. And the thought was that we got to open up a clinic here in the lab, which they did. And everybody's got to start practicing again. You can't do what you're doing in the development of these tests and the support of these tests and the teaching of these tests unless you're using them with patients.
I love that idea.
And
I love that idea.
Yeah, it was powerful, and it was
and to all of that, I would say maybe a couple of things. One is that, and there are a lot of functional medicine labs, and we can name names here. All right, we're independent. We're not being driven by any financial interest with anybody. Cyrix Labs, for example, I would love to see them look at all of their arrays and look at every analyte on every array and look at how often it comes back positive or negative, and then drop off the things that really never show up as anything useful and add something else. Like, go back and almost do an overhaul of all the different panels that they offer, just to make sure that every single thing there has a chance of catching something that might be clinically useful. And not just Cyrex, any lab, any functional diagnostic lab that offers panels, I think, should at some level or some time frame do that.
I think you're right. And someone that doesn't get a lot of attention in this space, but a real pioneer, was Stephen Barry. Stephen Barry created the stool test that is run 99% of the time in functional medicine. And he was the founder of this Genova. And he really understood that unless a test brought relevant information to the doctor-patient relationship that was actionable, it probably isn't worth having there.
Yeah.
And it wasn't an academic exercise. He was is a strong advocate for that. So
I think, and I'm just speaking off the top of my head now, I think there's probably two types of errors in decisions to have or not have things on a test panel. One is not including things that are relevant and actionable. And the other is information overload, right? Data for the sake of data. Because, and I don't know where I clued into this, but it seemed to me that there was a point when more companies started cropping up and competing in the diagnostic space, that there seemed to be a shift towards information-laden or information-heavy reports. Maybe with the idea that more information is better, and you and I know that that's not always true. Like sometimes more information, particularly if it's not relevant or actionable, just causes confusion. And I'll point out some of the recent changes, for example, with like Vibrant Labs has their gut zoomer. And the amount of information, and it's not just Vibrant and not just that particular test, but I find more often than not thinking to myself, number one, I wish labs would just be labs and stop trying to be clinicians. Don't put treatment or lifestyle or diet recommendations in your reports. That's my job, right? And the other part is, and I'll use this as a specific example, and this is top of mind for me because about 2 weeks ago, I did a webinar for a couple of hundred docs down over in the UK, sponsored by Apex Energetics, right? It was about the microbiome and mucosal immunity. And the slide deck that they wanted me to use was a couple of years old. So I wanted to refresh it and just add some new stuff. And I came across a paper that looked at short-chain fatty acid production between two groups of people where they measured baseline short-chain fatty acids and fiber intake in their diet. And they split the two groups, and all these people had low fiber intake. And one group increased their fiber to, I think it was 40 grams per day for whatever their baseline was. The other kept their fiber intake at baseline, but added in fermented foods. And at the end of a 10-week study, they looked at their microbiome, and they measured the short-chain fatty acids, and the fermented foods outperformed the high fiber diet in terms of diversity in the microbiome, as well as production of short-chain fatty acids and control of inflammatory chemicals. So that's one thing. But, we see this trend in labs that do measure the microbiome to measure dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of different species. Now, we know, as a result of the gut, the Human Microbiome Project, we've identified almost 5,000 genetically individual species. But what I learned in prepping for this webinar was that roughly 70% of them have never been cultured. We don't even know what they do. We just know they're there.
Right.
And so we get a report from, any lab that looks at the microbiome, particularly in detail, and there's literally nothing you can do with it clinically. Right. There's nothing you can do.
Right.
And so anyways, that's a little bit of my diatribe, but I like the perspective that you have, and it's comforting to know, at least at some point in the history, that somebody was asking the question, well, how can we help clinicians
Yes.
have more insight into their, their clients' health and wellness, rather than simply what can we sell in the market? Because you and I both know there are tests out there that none of us as clinicians should ever spend money on.
Right.
I'm not going to ask you to name them, but because I know you probably have your own.
I tell them to my patients all the time when they bring the test in. I'm like, I can't use this. It's not helpful to me. And they're like, oh, but my last doctor thought this was going to tell me all the answers. I'm like, they may know something I don't know. I can't get any usefulness out of this.
Yeah. Having said that, what do you find utility in? Like you suggested earlier that labs are not the end all be all of being a functional medicine practitioner. And yet it seems to me that just in common usage of the word, if somebody runs labs and provides supplements, they just call that functional medicine, which I don't know. I don't know that I will qualify that as. But what are the tests that you feel are worth considering in most, if not all cases? So like aside from just, a good set of blood work, like surveying foundational physiology, in terms of specialty labs, or maybe even let's call them specialty serum testing, what do you find yourself going to on a routine basis? What are the high value ones?
I think I'm going to surprise you and say that I think there are standard reference lab tests that are not typically run that are in my essential toolbox. And I go to those so much earlier than I used to. I used to go right for all the specialty tests. And this is not at all insinuating that when I have a difficult autoimmune case in front of me, I'm not right away trying to figure out what antibodies I'm looking at through the appropriate Cyrex test or the gut test, right? But there are some very high-level markers that I think are ignored.
Let's start with those.
And so complement C3, complement C4, complement C3A, complement C4A, completely ignored. And I love these complement proteins. In fact, I had the pleasure of talking to one of the medical physicians who was part of the development of complement C4A. And I'm like, I can't believe, like you discovered that. He's like, well, yeah, you have to. And then he went on to why, and it seemed so obvious to him. These are markers that are part of the inflammatory cascade, but they more often than not are related to some form of stealth pathogen wreaking havoc and tissue injury in the body. Now, to me, to know that we're dealing with a stealth pathogen, now I can't tell what it is. I don't know if I'm dealing with cytomegalovirus, Epstein-Barr virus, Coxsackie. I don't know what I'm dealing with, right? But I'm dealing with something in that arena, as opposed to mold, a toxin like mold toxin, or a biome issue, or a detox issue. Like our tissue is breaking down for that reason or another one. There's another follow-up marker to that, which is the degree of tissue injury going on, because I want to know if I'm being entrusted with a case, is my first aid in the beginning all about trying to just stop more tissues from breaking down because they're in this absolute swell of inflammation that is breaking down tissue? Or did tissue break down in the past in this process, and they're just dealing with the struggle now that like something broke down? Thyroid broke down, other endocrine tissue broke down, muscle or connective tissue broke down. And I get a lot of value out of MMP9, which is a really good indicator because it's secreted by neutrophils in the expression of trying to break tissue down to try to solve.
Yeah, if I remember, it degrades the extracellular matrix.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's like the body's beautiful response to saying something so bad is happening here.
Yeah.
That we want to break these tissues down and just get rid of them. Like they're worthless. They're not helpful. Let's just break it down. There's too much inflammation. They're not even functional tissue anymore. And another one in that same category is TGF beta 1.
Yeah.
So to me, like when I look at the cluster of those, that's super important. I rarely run any glucose panel that if I'm interested in glucose metabolism, which I am with every single patient, because to some degree it could be an issue. It is not helpful to me to just see fasting glucose. That goes all over the place. insulin is not helpful for me either, because it's
Can I ask you why?
It's variable. It varies significantly, but the equivalent of insulin over a longer period of time is C-peptide.
Sure.
So I tag C-peptide, I tag fasting glucose. I could push those into a calculator developed at Oxford, at Cambridge,
HOMA calculator.
HOMA calculator.
Yeah.
You get a pretty accurate indicator of, hey, am I dealing with a patient who's got things heading more toward the insulin resistant side, where they're manufacturing a lot of insulin and their cells just aren't listening to that, or are we in the reactive hypoglycemia side of things?
I want to ask you about that, and I don't want to derail this conversation because I love where it's going. But I, over the years, because I've been using the HOMA calculator for, probably 15 years, something like that. And a pattern that I notice very frequently are people who have what I call, and I haven't been able to find any support for this in the literature, so this is just Steve's crazy brain trying to put clinical concepts together. I would call it insulin hypersensitivity, where in a client who's not a highly trained athlete, because you would expect this pattern in someone who is highly trained and very metabolically flexible and fat adapted, I see people with insulin, like HOMA scores, the percent S score, well over 200%. Well over 200%. And for those of you listening, if you're not familiar, normal insulin sensitivity is 100%. There's a couple of ways you can model that with an index or with a percentage. But I see this a lot of times in your really severe reactive hypoglycemics who they don't handle low carb, they don't handle intermittent fasting, they tried keto and it made them worse, and that picture is, to me, quite often associated with this very, very high insulin sensitivity. Is this a pattern that you've noticed?
So often.
Yeah.
So often. And it's often accompanied with a low triglyceride, which you would expect. The body's not storing fuel in the bloodstream. Sure. It's often associated with a high morning cortisol level, because whatever that fasting level is just got a whole lot worse first thing in the morning. And interestingly, it's associated with a low LDH. So, the further that LDH is below 140, the more times they're bonking and may not even know it during the day.
Yeah.
And if I could get like that group of markers, it gives me everything. And now patients like, but my hemoglobin A1C is this, and I've worn a continuous glucose monitor, and I try to emphasize to them that there are so many backup power supply, energy supply, fuel supply mechanisms, because the brain doesn't produce or store any fuel, It just thinks it's the smartest person in the room, so it's going to regulate everything else. And whenever that blood sugar drops a little bit down, it will pump a bunch of cortisol out of the adrenals and create, gluconeogenesis from the liver. There's just stuff going on under the hood that makes those two things. That if I see really high or really low fasting blood sugars, I know the mechanism has failed. If I see a high hemoglobin A1C, I know the mechanism's failed. Like, at that point, for a long time, they're already caramelizing their body because of excess sugar. Those are endpoint markers to me, as opposed to functional markers, which is like a process. The process markers of including the HOMA calculation, which is very functional. The LDH calculation, looking at triglycerides, these are really valuable to me to see. And I see that description that you were just noting, that clinical presentation, in many perimenopausal women who are really transitioning poorly, and therefore in them I will see a pregnenolone level really low, because that pregnenolone, that mother hormone, is being stolen to create all that cortisol to manage the blood sugar issue. And of course they can be extraordinarily low or marginal in estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone and DHEA. And their GABA levels are typically depleted, by the best tools I have to measure that, which is kind of using a symptom survey, but it's really helpful for me to see that. And, they don't have the one neurotransmitter in their brain that is like regulating everything. Everything else is excitatory, and they're just off to the races in being in this stress loop, and they feel terrible. I mean, their body is just betraying them, apparently on so many levels. But
all right, let's go back to the main thought was labs that you appreciate that are not commonly ordered in serum. So you talked about complement tests. You talked about MMP9. Then we kind of did this little sidebar off into dysglycemias, which I think is helpful. What else would you typically include in your, and I'm assuming this is kind of like your initial evaluation when you're just engaging with a patient for the first time?
Yes. And, I don't have, as is the case with you, every patient is like a snowflake to me. It's like, I love that part of what I do, which is I view them uniquely. I don't have the Rachman panel that I check a box, but when I suspect tissue injury, when I suspect that we may be dealing with tissue breakdown or a potential organism, I use this. When I suspect that there's a strong issue of glucose dysregulation in one direction or another, I'd order that. I find often in immune dysregulation that glutathione depletion is central to that. Vitamin D, vitamin A, glutathione, and what you just mentioned, which is short chain fatty acid. So I'm all about repeated vitamin Ds and really targeting that toward a higher level in the beginning and then toward a more useful level afterwards. But I don't go by dosages. I'm going by lab values.
Sure.
And I will run that test a dozen times till I dial somebody in. And I don't get a lot of value out of vitamin A testing, but I get a lot of value out of using vitamin A.
What's your issue with vitamin A testing?
The liver does some really weird things with it, and it stores it so you can measure vitamin A as low, but you give somebody vitamin A, it's not going to go up substantially. And then the liver's metabolizing it, and all you're going to do is create a toxic liver. And the problem if you keep loading them up with more A for too long a period of time. But even though it's like the third rail of what I do, like there are a few compounds that I recommend that I'm like, ooh, I really got to keep a close eye on this because it could really help. And if I lose contact with it, it could go too high and hurt. Vitamin A is one of those. It can be extraordinarily helpful at high doses initially in care. And then if I don't tail out, bring that back, I'm going to start to see the liver be unhappy. And glutathione is a really hard sucker to measure because it is extraordinarily fragile molecule in the body. It goes away. So we have two surrogates in standard lab testing that I find very valuable for glutathione levels. One is GGT. Now that's typically something that people think of as associated with liver function, but the studies are pretty strong that you have a GGT lower than 17. 16 is kind of where I want them or below. But if you have a GGT, above that, you're sucking up glutathione at an incredible rate and you don't have enough to process. We don't know whether that's a recycling issue or a substrate issue. Is there enough glutathione going in? Are they recycling glutathione, which is very fragile? And the other one that I use is oxidized LDL. These are very good. That's not the regular LDL, but it's specifically the oxidized version. Some labs will do an oxidized phospholipid test. I just think Quest will do it, but LabCorp won't. But that's also a very valuable one. But these oxidized lipid markers are great because the body doesn't want oxidized lipids, so it uses glutathione to satisfy those lipids and reduce them and not make them dangerous in the body.
So you're using the ox-LDL. I'm sure it's case specific, but in general, as an indicator of glutathione sufficiency or their antioxidant capacity in general, as opposed to using it as part of a deeper cardiovascular workup, which you would use it then as well. But there are other, and this is something that I've been harping on for years in teaching seminars, is that we tend to pigeonhole markers as, we learn it as this tells me this, like GGT tells me about potential gallbladder issues. And I'm with you. I've been using GGT as a proxy for glutathione for quite a while. And I haven't put a hard number on it. I typically look at the lab range and look at whether or not they're creeping into the upper third of the lab range. I kind of like the idea of having something that's a little bit more, this is a hard line. So I'll have to play with that in my own clients to see which I like better. But we silo, we pigeonhole these lab markers. And, it's great to go to a functional blood chemistry analysis, of course, but, for guys, if you're listening and you're new to functional medicine, there's more to learn than these basic courses. And the basic courses might be overwhelming if you're coming from a background where you don't have any knowledge of diagnostics. But, when you master the basics, that's just really just kind of the beginning of your journey when it comes to diagnostics. Would you agree with that?
100%. And one little detour I wanted to take comes back to where you started today, which is our first meeting. I know exactly where it was in Charlotte, North Carolina. I know exactly the hotel room. I know exactly what we were doing. And I know exactly the course, which was the fundamentals of functional blood chemistry analysis. And I know that because a colleague of mine, Russell Scher, who always gives me the best information about like who's out there teaching cool stuff. He said, there's this guy named Datis Karazian, and he's just like a complete propeller head wizard about functional medicine. And he has a perspective that other people don't have, but he's so familiar with the information that it comes out really fast. And you may want to go find a place where his course that he has created is being taught by others, somebody in his faculty, because it may be at a slower pace. And I found you. I was really not using Apex products. I wasn't familiar with Datis's work. I got into that room, and it was the same fundamental shift that I had sitting in that room the first time with Jeff Bland, because not only were you presenting information that, obviously Datis worked really hard to cull out, but you were making it so tangible and so accessible. And I think that was the compliment that I gave you. It's like when you're really a master at something, which you are a master teacher. When you're a master, it almost seems effortless, and to the learner, it seems effortless. And I had that experience where I was like, oh my God, like everything I thought I knew, and I had already been in the lab industry and out of the lab industry, and you could have absolutely told me before this, I don't know how much you're going to get out of a basic lab course on CBC and the CMP. And I would have said, yeah, you're probably right, but I'm going to put my butt in the chair. I came out with principles that I still use today from you. So I wanted to, on behalf of myself, because I'm an enlivened teacher and doctor because of you and your delivery and sharing of your clinical insight about this work, and also because of Datis. Like I was no way I would be doing what I'm doing right now.
I feel the same way about Datis, and I feel a little what's the word, embarrassed almost to be mentioned in the same sentence as Jeff Bland. But I appreciate it. I really do. And I think I would hate to go back if we had recorded, let's say, the very first functional medicine seminar I ever taught, or even the one where you and I met. I would probably not enjoy going back and listening to myself, because you evolve and your perspective on things changes. The lens through which you see human function widens. You start to consider other things, as we've been teasing around with these lab markers that you go to before you go to specialty tests. But I appreciate your kind words. I really do, truly.
Thank you.
So back to the labs, and let's finish this off and move on to something else. We've been nattering on for almost an hour now, and I have more time. If you have more time, we can keep this going as long as it makes sense. So we were talking about, let's say atypical labs that you like to include on a frequent basis. You said complement. We talked about MMP9, relevant blood sugar stuff. And what else? Oh, you're talking about glutathione was the last thing, some of the proxies. Is there anything else, or is that kind of your core additional deeper things that you like to look at?
Into the immune system area, I do get value before I order specialized laboratory tests. I get value out of CD4, CD8 studies.
Sure.
They give me a lot of indication of whether the immune system is in a relatively regulated state or whether it's dysregulated. And it will tell me somewhat of the direction it's dysregulated. Are we having some trouble regulating it, or is it being thrown into an overly aggressive area? Is the normal seatbelt in place for the immune system to function, but not to go crazy? Or is there something really crazy happening that the immune system is reacting to? Right. So I get that answer. And although I believe that a lot of practitioners looking for stealth infections, we see an elevated MMP9, C4A is up, TGF beta 1 is up. We're like, okay, something is going on in an organism realm. I'm running strep tests very frequently. I'm looking at also, besides Epstein-Barr, and the more clinically relevant marker that I find is the early EBV IgG. And although we would think that an IgG marker is like maybe something in the back, it's not something in the back at 150.
Yeah.
Right. So I get a lot of value from that. A lot of people order CMP, but there's some things I order regularly that I don't see a lot of other practitioners ordering more regularly. I order chlamydia pneumonia. It sounds like a STD, but it's not. It's a strongly transmitted cardiovascular. It can be involved in other areas, but when I think about microvascular problems, when I think about perfusion issues, when I think about, hey, what's ripping up the endothelium, I'm looking for the presence of that. And I will say for the gastrointestinal tract, most people aren't checking Coxsackie group B. And they're aware of this thing called hand, foot, and mouth disease, which is Coxsackie A, but they're not tracking Coxsackie B. And man, do I pick a bunch of that up. And I pick it up in these patients that have relatively normal biomes, and they're just showing an inflammatory result on a stool analysis. And maybe there's some inflammatory markers indicating that the gut is lit up, but we're not really seeing SIBO, and we're not really seeing dysbiosis. I used to stop there and like, well, it's just there. And I never thought of what I would call viral dysbiosis. Yeah. And it's a weird word, right? Because there isn't necessarily a normal viral biome. Like, we're not supposed to have a bunch of viruses in our gut as we are bacteria.
Yeah, and I have the same experience and perspective. Another one that I might find in the gut, or I should say find in blood testing, but we connect it clinically to what's happening in the gut, is adenovirus. And interestingly, at least from my perspective, and again, I can only speak to what I see. I can't speak to what everyone else sees, but I tend to see with people who have these viral issues in the gut, they're very hypersensitive. And even to the point where sometimes drinking water can trigger their gut symptomatology. Is that consistent with what you see as well?
And that tells me, yes, and it tells me that we are not dealing with this kind of superficial mechanism of there's an infection and then you get rid of the infection and you fix the problem, but that the gut is this extraordinarily complicated neurologic organism, a muscular organism, an immune there's no greater confluence of weird systems all together in one place than the gut. And when you put water in and that water shouldn't really trigger enzymes, it should not trigger gastrin to be produced or cholecystokinin, it shouldn't trigger any of that. Like, it should be pretty neutral. And you're seeing the pure active motility of peristalsis just light these people up, and their immune systems are crazy. Yeah. It makes me think about viral issues in the gut all the time. Yeah. With
your CD4, CD8 panels, do you break the CD4 down into T helper subsets, or are you happy with that surface level?
I don't. In my first pass through the reference laboratory, I can order that if I'm interested in it, but for the most part, no.
I think this conversation begs a larger question as to, like, what is your clinical model, right? Because we talked earlier about how a lot of people in the functional medicine space, they have baseline knowledge and they rely on that wonderful innate intelligence in the human body to fix things. All they're doing is changing simple inputs like a gut protocol and a detox. And that's kind of like, to me, that's like maybe tier 1 applications of functional medicine principles. But as we both recognized, functional medicine it's more complicated. It's a larger arena with more players. And the more you practice and the more you learn, the more, one consequence is the more you know you don't know, right? The smarter I get, the dumber I feel is usually how I phrase that. But what is the model that you're operating in? And I'm fascinated with models, and I probably mentioned this on maybe the last podcast that I did in the Func Nation, but every couple of years I try to sit back and ask myself, what have I learned and what should I change in my thought process? And sometime last year, I spent some time, just creating a PowerPoint graphic that I've used in seminars to say, hey guys, this is, for better or for worse, this is my current clinical model. This is, for lack of a better way of saying it, Steve's brain on a slide. If you were to put words or to verbally paint out your clinical model, where would you start and what's in the model?
So that has really evolved a lot. And in the last 10 years, I feel much better, stronger, and capable in the model I'm currently using and have refined. Prior to that, I would have called it a primary care model that I was shoehorning functional medicine into. Anybody that showed up to see me, to be with me, to have my expertise, I would welcome. Any case, any issue, any perspective the patient would have. I didn't even think about the cosmology from which they were coming and what their skill sets are and their capabilities. And my model also was a little bit more, hey, let's figure out what's wrong with you. We'll put some things in place, and why don't you schedule some period of time in the future and we can check in on labs and symptoms and that. It was loose. That model does not work for me, especially with complex cases. There was not enough structure around it, and nor was there enough of my heart and my head for those patients. And those doctors practicing that model, looking after a couple thousand patients at a time, not all the time, but they're rotating in and out of that practice. That's the average for kind of even an alternative or functional primary care practice. I made the strong decision that I was going to cap at 50 brand new patients to me a year, and a total group of people that I was actively looking after at the range of about 300 people. Mm-hmm. That's where beyond that, it was not comfortable because I didn't have the heart and head to keep context. We talk in AI now about context. Well, we're AI also, right? We're intelligence, right? And our intelligence could only hold a certain amount of context. And beyond that number, I can't really remember the granularity of what's going on with a patient, and I need that. And I asked patients early on to let me know some things about their perspective of their life, their issues, their capabilities of addressing things, if there's stumbling blocks. I'm trying to understand if there's anything in their world before we even get started that could make it a stumbling block for them to get well. And I spend a lot of time trying to figure out if people are in the right place. Yeah. And if they're not in the right place, I don't hesitate right now to try to get them to the right place. I don't jettison them. I'm like, okay, this may be another good place for you, but I know it's not me. This model either doesn't work because you don't have the time to dedicate toward it, or you just lost your job and you may not be able to have the resources for some testing and supplements. You're just feeding your family right now, and nothing I say or do is going to change that. And once it changes, there'll be some resources to put toward that. I'm really trying to understand if their cosmology matches mine. Has every doctor prior to them done them wrong? Are they looking through a particular lens, which I can understand it because I did it, which is if you don't feel good and you've seen a lot of people and they're all letting you down, you might then be looking for the next person to let you down. Yeah. And my guess is if you're doing that, that probably will happen. And I don't want to be part of the list. I don't want to let somebody down. Yeah. So I think I spend a lot of time figuring out if people are in the right place. And then I dig deeply into a small select group of people in their first year with me. Most cases that I work with have a complexity that takes a bit of time to unravel. And I also am working with individuals who have that arc mindset. They're like, okay, can you show me I could feel a little bit better? And if you can show me I feel a little better, I'm okay for the longer ride if this is going to get me better. And that really serves me. It really serves my patients because I can be fully present. I'm my best. I know them. I am in constant communication with my patients. I'm not waiting for them to have a scheduled appointment with me. I'm in a synchronous conversation about their health with them via text and email, and we do have frequent scheduled consultations and progress evaluations of small subsets of labs, but the process works for me. I don't think that would work for everybody, but it really does.
And I had suggested when you and I were texting back and forth, I suggested that maybe we could talk about the idea that as clinicians, we have to make a choice between volume and engagement. You can't have both, right? Those are at opposite ends of the spectrum. So if like I think you and I practice in a similar fashion. I like to spend time with clients. I like to explain things to them. I like to be their partner, their cheerleader, their educator, their whatever. And so it's not unusual for me to spend an hour and a half, just depending on what we're doing on any given appointment. And so, if I'm spending an hour with every person, I can't see 20 people in a day. But there are a lot of functional medicine clinics. And like early on when I started doing this, I had joined a practice management group out in Texas, and essentially their model was high volume, low cost programs, essentially based around do some subtle dietary changes, fix the gut, do a detox, and spend 20 minutes in follow up consultation. And I discovered very quickly that was not for me. I don't like to operate. Now that doesn't mean that again you can't help people in a high volume practice, but in a high volume practice, it necessitates pre-programming and a lack of personalization. And so there's this trade-off between, and I really would encourage anyone listening who's either new to functional medicine or just getting into it. And even if you're in functional medicine for a while, you're kind of in a mode of just thinking about who you are and what you're doing. You have to figure out what kind of clinician you want to be and what kind of people you want to help. And if your goal is volume, then you have to be satisfied with low engagement, short visits, and pre-programmed approaches, which will work for many people as long as they're not beyond a certain point in that scale of complexity. Because the more complex the case makes or becomes, the more it requires in terms of time and investment and that high engagement. Yes. So anyways, that was me offering my opinion.
And I think that perspective matches mine. And I need to be, when I share with patients, there are some critical elements to care working. And most patients will focus initially on how much will something cost? And do they have the money to pay for that?
Yeah.
And I try to remind them that the most expensive care is the one that doesn't work. Every dollar you spend is something that's not working for you. You're losing time and you're losing your money. Number two, the ability to fully engage and to communicate well together is a two-way street. Everybody's got to be able to be present. Do we remain committed through the diagnostic and treatment process? Do we remain good, clear, and kind communicators with each other? And do we keep that engagement? And everybody's engaged in the beginning. There's a lot of symptoms keeping them engaged.
Oh, yeah.
Really well, somebody needs to remain engaged with the goal, and the goal is not symptom reduction.
Yeah.
The goal is the restoration of the normal vitality that should be in their body.
Which brings up another level of conversation in terms of clinical model, because that, I think the first iteration of that is, what tests do I run? What metabolic processes am I interested in? But there's also a model that kind of supersedes that at the 30,000 foot view. And that's how you progress somebody from, I have active symptoms and problems, deficits in quality of life that I'm trying to fix, from that point all the way to ensuring quality of life as someone ages, so longevity, right? And that's something else I've been putting a lot of thought into for myself, is how do I walk someone through the journey? It's so overused, but it's so true. How do you walk someone through that journey of, I'm initially presenting because I have XYZ complaints and problems. What diagnostics can we run to figure out what to do? What am I going to do? How do I do that? How do I troubleshoot problems along the way? And at what point in the conversation have I had enough progress and demonstrated stability and resilience that I can start talking about my future? Because that initial phase is all reactive here and now. But at some point, I think for you and I as clinicians, the best outcome we can ever hope for is to have someone age gracefully and either very, very long time cycles delay sometimes the inevitable, or maybe prevent them and someone just literally dies of old age. It's just a time factor.
I used to defer that conversation.
Me too.
And I don't anymore. I create for every patient that I begin working with, once we've done the full, history and diagnostic workup, I create a document that's a health roadmap. It is about a 12 to 15 page document, both graphically depicting and narratively depicting their entire timeline of what's gone on with them, where I think they are right now from a cause and effect point of view as a map, like what's cause and what's effect, and all of the parts are on there, as well as the lines connecting it all. A Kanban chart showing the prioritization. What do we do first, second, and third in your care? And I then also do a risk analysis with them, which is, interestingly, you would think the most interesting thing to patients would be what's wrong with me and what's cause and effect, because I promise them I'm going to provide that for them. And I love giving it to them because that's like the golden ring for me.
Sure.
Patients are so appropriately interested in the 2 lines I create. I do a 10-year risk analysis for them, specific to them. Based on what we know about you, there's a divergent path here. A, what happens to you and your capabilities in 10 years? What is your risk of losing your health span? Even though you're only 10 years older, your health span's gone. And in many patients, because I'm working with very chronically ill patients, that risk, it does not surprise me to see them at a 70, 80, 90% risk of something serious, like a showstopper for them. Stroke, heart attack, cancer, some endpoint, right? Within a 10-year period. And then the other fork of that, which is I do the analysis, which is if we do everything I'd like to do to reshape and restore vitality for you, what does your risk look like in 10 years? And for the most part, except in the worst of cases, it actually goes down significantly. And in the worst of cases, we can marginally keep them where they are and not make the risk go much higher than where they are right now. And we also do an analysis to determine, like, what's the window of opportunity? Is it 1 year? Do they have a year left to spin this thing around before they've lost too much tissue, too much injury? It's just hard. Do we have a 3-year window? Do we have a 5-year window? That's really helpful because I then can pivot to ask a patient, do you want your health span to meet your lifespan? Do you want your brain span to meet your lifespan? Mm. And they've never been asked that before. It's like the first dentist I ever went to that said, hey, do you want to keep your teeth your whole life? And I'm like, I just laughed. I thought, this is the crazy, yes. He's like, well, you got to floss, you have to water pick, you got to and he went on through everything. When I ask patients, do you want your brain to be with you your whole life? that's a big question for them that they don't really think about. And then it just takes about a pause, and they're really, of course, very enthusiastic about keeping that.
And it really, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that really shifts the frame of reference away from chasing symptoms to really the deep value propositions.
Yes.
So how are you calculating or modeling these estimates? Are these things like
there are very few good tools out there, and what I began to do was cull research around longevity and the imbalance of certain systems and how they affect that longevity.
Yeah.
And my brain isn't big enough, so I stuck it into a model that I have continued to train and refine with. I think I may be up to a few hundred studies now that inform that model. And I'm using the big brain of artificial intelligence to just take all the lab values and pour it into that and come and create the assessment. And
so you're not
very
calculating
good uses for AI, and that's one of them, is like multivariate analysis based on all these things that we know and the things that are going on with you. What does it look like for you moving forward? Right.
So you're not doing like a simple 10-year ASCVD calculation or an intermountain risk score or something like that. So you're training your own large language model using data that's published in the medical literature and then feeding patient data into that.
Yeah, and just to clarify, the words in this space are typically important. I don't have any skills in training a model, which is like, that's like the way the model thinks. What I'm giving the model is a knowledge base, and it's trained already, which is great. And then all I have to do is harness that.
Yeah.
And I've created a different harness for how it pours its way through that data, and hundreds of hours of training it to do that.
Which AI platform are you using?
Claude. I don't really use anything else than that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is coded stuff. Like, I've deeply gotten into the ability to code because it just is able to allow me to ask it to do some hard logic and fuzzy logic things together.
Yeah. It sounds like we might have to do a part 2.
I would love that.
Yeah, because I am very, I don't know, I would put myself in a computer savvy segment of the population. I love technology. I've used it my entire clinical practice, and we're in such an interesting time right now with AI. But along with as good as it is, there has to be so many caveats about be careful. Careful how you use it and all that kind of stuff. So maybe we can delay that to another conversation. All right, so let's switch the conversation to the topic. It's taken almost an hour and a half to get to the main topic, but this has been a wonderful conversation. I think I could sit with you and pick your brain for hours at a time for sure.
Thanks.
Let's talk about vitalism. Let's start with you defining that, and then explain to me why you wanted to talk about it.
It's such an unsexy topic in medicine, because what tends to get my attention and my patient's attention is like, oh, this new substance came out that fixes this symptom. I will field a dozen questions a week. I've read this article, I got this email, and like, will this fix the thing? Because all the snake oil always says, like, it gives a list of 18,000 symptoms. The same thing with the labs. It's like, you're going to use the lab for cardiovascular. I can figure something out with this. And I think it has taken me a really long time to not get entertained by the shiny objects of that, and to get into something more heart-centered, energetically, spiritually grounded in how I view the world, which is, I really see for each of us like perfection unfolding in our personalities, in our relations. We're all just learning, right? We're all just like kids still learning how to talk to each other and how to deal with feelings and how to deal with the world and unraveling business things and unraveling personal things, and we're all learning. And I think our bodies are also on a trajectory if we let our bodies do that. I believe that there is inherently a miracle going on in our bodies where it is constantly self-correcting for us, and these symptoms are occurring either as the self-correction. Some symptoms represent the correction of the body, or the corrections failed and you got some really serious things breaking down and injury, and what you're feeling are tissues being injured or dying off.
Right.
And that perspective sounds like a few people would argue with that, but it makes such a different outcome if that's your guiding principle as a clinician, as opposed to just agreeing with it. Because the principle of, hey, we've got to give the body everything it needs to be able to restore itself, and we've got to trust that the body can do this, is a different approach than this organism is present, we're going to kill it. This inflammation is there. How do you quench that inflammation?
Yeah, and sometimes you don't want to.
Right. Right. Yeah. So to me, it has gotten down to a fork in the road. Am I about doing or being? Am I a human doer or a human being? Am I a doctor doer or am I a doctor being? Am I doing or allowing? And those are two very different principles, because I can look at a woman's physiology going through perimenopause and think, science fair experiment, this one's low and this one's high, and I'm going to whack-a-mole this one down and this one will come up, and I can do that. And I did that. And you can hold that together for a little while, and then you realize like you're a puppeteer, it's just not going to work. Or you could figure out how to establish the normal balance that's supposed to be there. Like take away the stuff, the inflammation or the gut issues or the confusion in the liver or the way that estrogen recycling is occurring. Like take away the problem that is impairing the body from self-regulating itself, and suddenly things become regulated a whole lot better. To me, vitalism is a undying appreciation for the notion that our role with the body is to be a steward. It's not to be the fixer. It's not to be the mechanism manipulator. I still think there's a role for surgery. I still think there's a role for medicine. I still think there's a role for doing in circumstances. I think I'm talking about the triage of what do I think is most important in my consideration of a patient. And when I'm in front of a patient who has had sometimes a lifetime, literally a lifetime of impairment, I am looking through that functional lens, but I'm really looking through what in the world is going on here that what a normally healthy body that should be regulating itself is not regulating itself in the form of the person in front of me right now. What is going on there? Like it's a denial of a birthright to me. So I feel even more committed and enthusiastic and interested and curious about what is going on here with this person that is stopping something that should be there, as opposed to I'm a master diagnostician, I'm going to come up with the right label, and the label will lead me to a formulary of treatment, and the formulary of treatment will lead to the patient's symptoms going away. Two very different approaches, two different biases.
Yeah, and I think it opens up to this idea that has come out several times in conversation, that just because a lab is abnormal doesn't mean you must do something about it. Just because a symptom is present doesn't mean you should do something to get rid of it, at least, not in the short term. And so vitalism, my understanding of, like, if we could offer a definition, might go something like, we as humans, we go beyond our structure and our physiology, right? We're not just biochemistry, for example. Like there is a present governing intelligence. In chiropractic, we call it the innate intelligence. Again, maybe Oriental medicine, they call it chi. I think different healing disciplines have different names for similar concepts, but this idea that there is a governing intelligence that has the capacity to adapt and maybe has aspects of stability and resilience, that when that process goes wrong is when we end up with changes in quality of life and symptom expression. But to your point, just because someone is expressing symptoms, it could very well be the attempt of this innate intelligence, this vital force, to adapt to something.
Right. That's how wellness works. It's symptoms lie. They lie all the time. They don't tell us when there is a problem sometimes. There's plenty of people that have had a cancerous process going on or a cardiovascular issue for decades, and then they get a symptom and they're like, oh, that just happened. Symptoms also lie in the other direction.
Yeah. That's not a point. I don't think I've appreciated that last point enough.
They are sometimes the indicator of a process going well that was asleep for a long time. If there are individuals who, albeit my population is probably skewed a lot like yours, where I'm seeing a lot of patients with like some wacky immune system stuff going on. Yeah. And I see a variety of archetypes of that. One archetype is they are an inflamed mess because their body is struggling really hard to deal with this. They're either poorly regulating or they're exuberantly attacking. And that's one archetype. But I see just as much of the other archetype where the immune system has become fatigued, and we call that immunosenescence, but like they can't get out of their own way immunologically. And this is an example symptomatically of someone who, when we start to get the immune system going again, we will get some inflammation signals that we've not seen before. I thanks to you, have really seen huge benefit to the implementation of nosodes, of homeopathic preparations that awaken the body's ability to know that there's an organism present. And, man, that can create some symptoms. I try to attenuate those symptoms and I try to help with that. But boy, when you're awakening a sleeping tiger, you can create some symptoms. And I'm not the kind of person that does like the Lyme treatment where you stick a port in somebody and pump them full of drugs long enough or antibiotics and they're just miserable with their symptoms. I don't believe in that. I'm a inherently very compassionate human being. I don't shy away from symptoms. I can hold a lot of space with my patients for symptoms and understanding that they sometimes are absolutely necessary and we can attenuate them.
Do you have preemptive conversations with people to that effect? Like, listen, as we go through this process, things are going to flare up and that's okay.
Especially on immunosenescent patients that their immune systems are asleep. When they wake up, I tell them it's like, look, you have the equivalent of a Ferrari body that's been up on blocks in your garage, in the back, dusty. And when we start up that engine, it's going to rattle potentially and spurt and black smoke. And we don't know what it's going to do. It's not going to start rolling out of your garage, and, just work its way slowly up to 120 miles an hour. It is going to be messy.
Yeah.
But we're going to work together, and you're going to tell me what you're feeling, and I will interpret that for you. And then we're going to work to attenuate that where possible, but also not become afraid of it. Because there's two layers here. There's the layer of the symptoms, and there's the layer of the patient's expectation about that. There's this classic experiment where they took a bunch of college students in the 50s, separated them into two groups. They got them to do this terrible experiment because they probably promised them free pizza. And they took one group and they put their hands on these electrodes where they zapped 10,000 volts at a really low amperage. It's terrible feeling, but it's not going to hurt you. And what they basically did was randomly shock them. And they told them, look, you can't have the pizza until you keep your hands on this through the entire experiment for an hour. They were a mess. Their cortisol was up. Everything was messy. They were a mess. Heart rate, all the things you would imagine, and telemetry were off. They took a second group and said, every 90 seconds, you will feel this. And although the first two created a little triggering response till they knew what to expect, once they knew what to expect, no cortisol increase, no heart rate increase, no blood pressure increase, no respiration increase, no perspiration, no sympathetic dominance from that for an entire hour. if we know what to expect with our body, we can handle a lot. It's that extra layer that becomes a problem.
That's highly informative. Highly. And like, I like stuff like that because it's got practical applications, because aside from managing our patient's physiology, we have to manage the patient too, right? We have to create reasonable expectations and prep them for the journey, so to speak. And I love the idea of having preemptive conversations. I've said many times in seminars that I'm a huge fan of not looking like an idiot. So I would rather tell someone to expect something and have it not happen than not tell them to expect something that does. And now from that point forward, I look like I don't know what I'm doing and I'm just trying to explain away something that happened to them. And I think, so are there any other things in your arsenal aside from, say, these preemptive type conversations that you like to employ with your clients in the first phase where you guys are just getting to know each other?
I don't know if you mean from a therapeutic point of view or from a information point of view, but I will say that
could be both.
From a therapeutic point of view, I think the world of using specialized pro-resolving mediators, because even a small amount of this substance, which we'll talk about for a while, can help a immune system which has been in an inflammatory dominant state regulate itself better. Most individuals are so depleted in what the body uses to biotransform omega-3 fatty acids into these substances, miracle substances that resolve inflammation, that if we give just a little bit of that to a patient, they're able to resolve these weird inflammatory instances so much better. And I don't mean like loading them up, but that stuff is powerful. It's really powerful. And whenever I think something we're going to do, be it slowly raising vitamin D levels, vitamin D, as you're aware, is a hormone, mislabeled, whatever it was 100 years ago. It's not a vitamin, it's not a Flintstone. It's the most powerful immune regulating hormone we have. Just bringing that up from a level of what some people would not consider to be low at 30, I consider that very low, but you bring that up to 30 to where I like to target my autoimmune patients at 80 to 90, their immune system's turning back on again. They will have some inflammatory symptoms. They'll have immune expressive symptoms. And adding just a small amount of pro-resolving SPM, specialized pro-resolving mediators, can make all the difference in the world at dampening, not alleviating. It's not a pain reliever. It's not an anti-inflammatory the way we think about it, but it can be extraordinarily helpful. And just helping patients to remember, from a communication point of view, that none of this is surprising me. And the doctors that I've trained, I share with them the most important words you can ever share if you really believe it are, "I'm not surprised." Because if you really aren't surprised by what they're saying, please voice that to your patient, because it gives them the comfort, like, I don't know why you're saying that, but thank goodness you're not surprised by this, because somebody's at the switch here. We see what's going on. I will, even when patients are describing a really weird series of symptoms to me, I will take a pause point and try to, before I even respond, understand how the different parts of their physiology connect to create that symptom. Then I will say, I'm not surprised. Here's what probably is happening right now. And when they hear, A, I'm not surprised, the person they're entrusting to guide them, and B, there's a reasonable explanation for what's going on here, and here's how we will know. We'll do this, wait this amount of time out, or add this, and if in 3 days, 5 days, 12 days, we don't see a shift, we're going to do something else. That's bank.
I think people, like, they want to know that you have a plan, first of all. And this is why I love the functional medicine, especially a thought out functional medicine approach, is because it is hierarchical, it is prioritized, and I love the idea that you implement a roadmap as you get started with your clients. To your point about saying I'm not surprised, I use a similar phrasing when I'm doing my new consults. Like, certainly there are some consults where I'm like, I'm not sure if I can help this person, and I will say that directly. Like, I would like to try, but I don't know if I can. But I find myself more often than not saying to people towards the end of the consult, like, there's nothing you said that confuses me. And you can see people visibly have a reaction to that. Like, it's almost like they go, finally, someone's listening. Finally, someone thinks that they can help me. And I think those are powerful techniques and tools. And, going back to what I was saying about managing the person, and what I mean by that is their mindset and their expectations, because those are, in some cases, their attitudes and expectations and their mindset is as powerful as anything we might prescribe from a supplementation standpoint. Right? You can give somebody, you can craft the most beautiful functional medicine protocol the world has ever seen. But if it's with a person who's glass half empty, not glass half full, and everyone falls on the negative, and they're in a living situation where not only do they not believe they're going to get better, but they have someone speaking into their life saying, you're never going to get better, then it doesn't matter that you have the best protocol ever. That's the power of that side of the equation.
I think that's really well said. And, thinking about that from a physiologic point of view, you really can't get well in a sympathetic dominant state. You can't get well if you are feeling in danger. Even if you have symptoms, if you don't feel in danger, there's the room to get better.
Sure.
Which is why I implement with lots of my patients whatever techniques I can think of to kind of short circuit the fear response that triggers sympathetic dominance, using polyvagal theory and lots of vagal toning exercises and Wim Hof breathing and some yoga poses and yoga breathing. Like, there's some really good techniques out there. Regular, low impact burst training. Like, these things definitely dampen the sympathetic response, and if it's matched to the patient, beautifully. And that's really important because we want to not have that play a huge role in this.
Do you feel that functional medicine has become too supplement centric, too diagnostic centric?
I think it's done both of those things, both. And I have had patients that have come to me and they're like, look, like, I know from talking to others, that somebody that referred you, like, I really believe like you're the one that can help me figure this out. And I don't think I can do a whole lot of testing. I don't think I can do a whole lot of supplementation. I can't tolerate it, or I can't afford it. And the challenge of working with a patient like that has been so incredibly rewarding, because without the tools of knowing what I'm dealing with, as I'm used to, and the tools of knowing how to treat something, which is what I'm used to using nutraceuticals to do that, as well as lifestyle implementation, the power of kind of barefoot medicine becomes obvious. Barefoot medicine was, in the communist revolution. If those people listening don't remember, the communist revolution occurred, and the whole healthcare system collapsed in China. Nothing was there. So what they did was they issued these books called the Barefoot Medicine Doctor's Manual, and they picked a person in each village and said, you are now this, you are going to do this. And it's a combination, almost all of Chinese medicine implementation: acupuncture, acupressure, herbs, lifestyle practices. And that ability to use barefoot medicine to be able to change someone's physiology using your skill, experience, and intuition about what's going on with somebody, and then using lifestyle principles outside of natural compounds that have been synthesized, refined, made more concentrated. That's some of the more rewarding things I've done with patients.
I'm
Yeah,
always
it's not as
excited.
fast as using some of the nutraceuticals, and I would still prefer to do that, but it's
Yeah.
really rewarding.
I'm always excited in someone's case progression when I can get them to start exercising. Or and that's been a big one, and that was like I was kind of forced into it because I, like you and everybody else, I've gone through an evolution in my my ability as a clinician. I keep learning, which is a wonderful thing about our industry. If you're open to it, every year you can be a better clinician. But I got to the point where I realized that I had become that style of functional medicine clinician who relied too much on the supplementation and paid too little attention to things like diet and lifestyle. And so I started intentionally, like my first consult, once someone says yes, they want to work with me, my first consult is a diet review. That's my very first thing before we even touch any supplements. And, this is just how I do it. It doesn't mean it's the right way or the best way to do it. It's just what seems to work for me. And then I always have the expectation of somebody, if one of my clients is not exercising, I have the expectation that we will at some point be talking about using that as a therapeutic tool, not just a generic, hey, let's just recognize that everybody should exercise, but as an intentional tool designed to move them further down the road. And then the challenge becomes, how do you implement that with somebody who's, lost all of their exercise tolerance and maybe exercised in the past, but had to stop because every time they exercise, they get worse. And that's, it can be challenging, but it certainly can be done. But it's, for me, it's really kind of opened my eyes to admit to myself, I'm trying to do too much with supplements and I'm leaving too much progress on the table because I'm not pulling on these very large levers of diet and lifestyle. And I'm not saying that this happened just in the last 6 months. Like this is an evolution that's been, going for years and years and years now. Let me ask you a couple of, let's say, closing questions. And I really would love to have another session with you and talk about
I love that.
your programming and your risk assessment models. If you were having a conversation with, let's say, someone who's been in practice for a while, any of the healthcare disciplines, and they're just looking at functional medicine going, I think I want to do it, but I'm not really sure. Say just tipping their toe. What advice would you give them about where to start or how to proceed becoming a functional medicine practitioner?
I think that's a great question, and I'm faced with that. Like I receive that kind of conversation frequently, and my answer is usually the same, which is, I think the quality of the information through the Coxsackie Institute is so high and so much clearer, better, and more factually accurate than anywhere else. I start them there, and I suggest not necessarily that they begin with the lab stuff, but if they could take a stab at a real multifaceted issue. So I direct them to the thyroid and Hashimoto's course, because you can hit the whole picture from that. You can hit labs and you can hit function and you really get a bigger sense of, oh my gosh, something that I used to think was a gland is a system.
Yeah.
It extends from the brain all the way to the mitochondria.
Yeah.
And you get it kind of really messes with your mind if you're not programmed to think about that. And it can give some tools that help people to help their patients right away. So I like that one because, it's a little bit of investment and probably it's a hard uplift to just sit your butt in a seat and get through that, because you have to really be willing to stretch. But if you're willing to do that, I think that is the best way to try it on and see if the model makes sense. And if some of the principles, maybe just one, could be used. Just grab the thyroid conversion issue problem, the conversion of T4 into T3, and say, hey, in all the patients I've been working with that seem to have euthyroid 6 syndrome, I'm measuring TSH, it's maybe a little bit high, but the T4 is normal, and I don't know what else to look at in a patient. I'll send them to an endocrinologist, which is like the kiss of death in those instances. Like, what do I do with that? Oh, I'll order a free T3 with my free T4, and now I got a picture, and oh, there may be an adrenal or liver thing going on here. That is just like, I've added a simple lab with a simple response that could have some lifestyle things, and maybe I add some adaptogens, and suddenly you are practicing functional medicine. You are definitely practicing it, and that's not a huge lift.
What do you think is the value for people starting out having, call it a clinical model, call it a framework? Like, for example, when we teach the blood chemistry course, the one thing that I like to start with is what I'll call the hierarchy of physiology. You hinted at this earlier, like looking at anemias and blood sugar issues, things that can alter energy supply, right? That has to be foundational because nothing happens without ATP, right?
Right.
And this was one thing that was
oxygen transport, like, right, all of that.
Yeah, this was one thing that for me when I was beginning, just getting into it, was really helpful because my mind is, and I understand that not everyone thinks the way I do or you do, but my mind automatically likes to sort information into categories, subcategories, systems. And so when someone says to me, hey, let's look at some labs, I want to know what do I look at first and why. Right? And you know, maybe to what I asked you to answer, I would add that anyone beginning, I think you need to have a solid framework, which is that bigger picture upon which you hang all your details. It's very easy to go to seminars in our space and get details that are difficult to put into practice because there's no larger framework to put that into position relative to other things that might be more fundamental.
I agree. I couldn't agree more. And because it's kind of like having the Christmas tree to hang the ornaments. Like, we don't want to hang the ornaments in the air. There's no place to put them. They're going to fall on the ground, right? You need the boughs, and then you can kind of hang something that makes it, you know, have meaning and substance and something that's enduring. I agree with you. That framework is, I think it's critical. And that probably would have made me a better practitioner earlier to have had the framework. It kind of got cobbled together over time. And maybe until you just mentioned it, it's something I might take for granted as something that I am unconsciously competent at. You know, there's that hierarchy of learning something. You're unconsciously incompetent when you start. You don't know what you don't know.
Right.
Then you become consciously incompetent. And that's not the place I like clinicians to be when I'm training them. I don't want them to think, oh my gosh, there's all this and I don't know this. It is a humbling place to be, but it's frustrating.
It is.
Then there's the consciously competent place. And you could get somebody there pretty quickly. Yeah. If they're willing. And then until you mention it, I think I've been, unconsciously competent of being able to just work through that framework when I'm working with the patient, and I would call it intuition. And I think there's some of that, but there's some experience and intuition and wisdom of doing this for a few decades where you kind of get that sense of that hierarchy of what should I do first, second, and third. And I agree, there's a prioritization that is absolutely critical.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the words of Datis Karazian, when you have a problem that's more fundamental than the problem you're focused on, you're not going to get right. He calls them deal breakers. Yeah. So, and I think that's a good starting point. Well, why don't we close off this episode, and we'll plan on scheduling a second conversation because I think you've got a lot more that would be worth sharing to the FuncMed Nation audience. So, Dr. Brad Rachman, I appreciate your time and your insight. It's always a pleasure, and I wish that we were actually in the same physical space more often, so I could shake your hands and put my arms around your neck.
Thank you.
It's good to see you.
Good to see you, Steve. Thank you so much.
Thank you.